PowerPoint slides are available on the right-hand side of the screen under Handouts. So if you want to take notes during the presentation, you can find the slides there. In today's webinar, we're going to cover the following topics: an overview of UNHCR's work in the Northern Triangle of Central America, which refers to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. We'll then discuss available UNHCR guidance on gang-based asylum claims and how this guidance can be used in U.S. proceedings. Next, we'll give a quick overview of asylum, outlining the legal elements to a claim, and then jump into a discussion of current issues and strategies for representing asylum seekers from the Northern Triangle in claims arising from gang violence. And lastly, we'll apply this material to a hypothetical case example. There'll be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please hold off on any questions until then. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Alice to talk about UNHCR's work in the US and the Northern Triangle.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. Well, welcome. We're very excited to have such interest in this topic, and very grateful to be partnering with Maggio Kattar on this webinar. I'm going to speak for a couple minutes to give some context on why UNHCR is engaged on gang-related issues right now. And first to say that our office here in Washington covers the United States and the Caribbean region. So we cover 27 Caribbean territories from this office, as well as the US. And in the US, what we do a great deal of is try to do what we can to support a well-functioning asylum system. And that includes training to asylum adjudicators and immigration judges, but also to try and support lawyers throughout the country, like the people on this call who are interested in representing asylum seekers and taking on what can be, in some instances, some quite complex cases. So we are deeply grateful for all of your engagement on this important issue. So now let me talk a little bit about the direct work we do in the Northern Triangle. So we have this office here in Washington, and then various presences in the Caribbean, and then we have a few offices in Mexico, in Panama, and then in the countries themselves. And so between all of that, we put in a fair amount to try and develop a regional strategy to try and protect asylum seekers coming out of the Northern Triangle, especially given the increasing problems we've been seeing in those areas for the last few years. Some of the things that we do listed on this slide, and in particular I want to point a little to the idea that we try to work cross-regionally, and we have convened a series of governmental dialogues with the governments affected by the migration from the Northern Triangle, including the home countries, including the Salvadoran, Honduran, and Guatemalan governments. And we have certainly been working with the US governments about recognition of gang-related cases, but also with treatment of asylum seekers who are in this country. But we've also been working with parallel asylum systems in Mexico, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Belize, and other countries of refuge to try and strengthen the response for this particular population throughout the region. We do engage in some strategic litigation on gang-related cases, and I know that there again, our next speaker, Anna, has a great deal of experience in that area as well, and so we try to find ways to strengthen the asylum system using a number of different tools. In the last couple of years, we've produced 2 reports that we will send you the links to after this webinar. One was called Children on the Run in 2014, and the second is Women on the Run in 2015. But let me first address Children on the Run. We wanted to use our regional networks to do research and monitoring and understand much more clearly what's going on and why we were seeing such escalated numbers of children and families leaving their homes and their countries of origin, and to assess whether or not this was a mixed migration with some real international protection concerns mixed in. That is, whether there are some real and very serious asylum and refugee cases mixed into these migrations. And the answer to that is we very much think that there are, and at this point UNHCR approaches the Northern Triangle as one of the more pressing refugee emergencies in the Americas region. So with children on the run, we were speaking with unaccompanied children from the Northern Triangle and also from Mexico, and trying to ascertain why they had left. And through doing this, we got a much better understanding of some of the gang-related reasons that children were fleeing their homes. We found that about 60% of the children in our interview pool had significant international protection concerns, and that's by saying that they would likely qualify for asylum if they were to go all the way through the process. And that for us was a big flag back in 2014. We had a very serious problem here. And we saw two particular patterns of harms. One was the violence by the organized criminal actors, non-state actors in these cases, typically the gangs. And the second was violence in the home and domestic violence problems. And for both of those areas, it is very possible to bring asylum-related cases in the US. So what Children on the Run did when we first produced it was really try and focus some attention on this idea that the unaccompanied child migration that had escalated. I mean, at that point, I don't know how many of you remember this, but before 2013, 2014, we were seeing less than 10,000 unaccompanied children come to the US every year. And then we saw these real spikes in the numbers where we were hitting 58,000, 60,000 children in a year. And so really understanding the profiles of why those children were moving. Children on the Run helped get some real information about what was going on and helped the asylum system prepare better to deal with it. So then the year later, we turned to Women on the Run, which, again, we wanted to assess a very similar question, but for the women and families that were leaving, because we wanted to see if it was just the unaccompanied children or other flight problems. And so there again, 64% of the women we interviewed for that study were targets of direct threats or attacks from the gangs. And in the course of that study, we collected just an enormous amount of information about the repeated violence against women from the gangs and in the domestic setting that was really of great concern to us. We also really got very strong indications from that study that the possibility for protection in the home country is incredibly difficult. So we're not only talking about non-state actors, these gangs targeting women and children, but we're talking about them having no recourse to the police, that very often the police were in collusion with the gangs themselves, or that women deeply feared going to the police about the problems they were experiencing. I think another factor to remember about these countries of origin is that they're very small. And we're talking about situations where, in El Salvador, I think there are 470 administrative districts. At this point, 450 of them are thought to be under the control of the gangs. So the possibility of being able to go somewhere else in the country to find an internal relocation and find safety there is really quite minimal. So these studies were useful for helping develop these ideas, helping get some of these ideas into the press, and also helping us present these ideas to policymakers in Washington with the previous administration and get to a position where we're able to talk more about how to come up with comprehensive solutions. And so that helped lead into the regional dialogues that I mentioned before. with UNHCR, with our offices in Mexico and in the region itself, being able to bring all these governments together and the US government as well to start trying to identify regional strategies and solutions. And so all of this effort is, of course, running parallel to what's going on in the courts. And that's where I'm going to turn it back to Colleen, and she can talk a little bit about the main topics for today, you know, sort of like not just the context that I'm trying to set here, but also how we can try and progress through the courts to find better solutions for these people.
All right, thank you, Alice. I'm now going to talk about international law and its relevance in U.S. courts, and pulling out specific guidance for gang-based asylum claims. So to start, I want to lay the framework for why international law is relevant in the U.S., which is a question we get a lot here at UNHCR. U.S. obligations under international refugee law stem from the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the 1967 Protocol. These instruments define the term refugee, outline the rights of displaced persons, and lay out the legal obligations of states to protect these persons. The U.S. acceded to the Protocol in 1968. The Protocol binds parties to comply with the substantive provisions of the Convention. So therefore, by acceding to the Protocol, the U.S. has committed to comply with its provisions and provide effective protection to refugees. This forms the sort of basis of the U.S.'s obligation to comply with international refugee law. And in addition to that, the U.S. has also made clear its intention to comply with international refugee law through domestic law. The 1980 Refugee Act was implemented with the express intent of bringing the U.S. into compliance with the Protocol, as recognized by the Supreme Court in the case Cardozo-Fonseca. The Refugee Act should therefore be interpreted in a manner consistent with the Protocol and the Convention. This slide shows how U.S. courts have used UNHCR guidance. Courts have looked to UNHCR guidance to interpret specific legal questions, such as what constitutes persecution or how to define and interpret the term membership in a particular social group. Courts have also looked to UNHCR reports in explaining country conditions in the asylum seeker's country of origin. UNHCR's reports can and should be submitted with an asylum claim to provide the adjudicator with background information and context about the human rights and refugee protection situation in the applicant's country of origin. So for example, the reports that Alice just discussed, Children on the Run and Women on the Run, can be submitted with a claim from Central America to demonstrate the conditions that both children and women are fleeing in these countries. This slide also shows other available UNHCR guidance, including the UNHCR Handbook on Procedures and Criteria for Determining Refugee Status, UNHCR's Guidelines on International Protection, UNHCR's Eligibility Guidelines, and our UNHCR reports. All of these resources were created to assist lawyers and adjudicators with proper interpretation of the refugee definition. And these resources are all available on our website and on RefWorld. So focusing on resources relevant to gang-related asylum claims, in 2010, UNHCR issued a guidance note on refugee claims relating to victims of organized gangs. Here I've pulled out some relevant material from those guidelines, and that includes the note gives an overview of gangs and their practices, discussing how gangs are organized, their culture, and their behavioral characteristics. Specific to this webinar, the note discusses the MARAs and their methods of recruitment, which may be relevant for providing the adjudicator with background information on conditions in the asylum seeker's country of origin. The note then discusses certain groups who may be targeted by gangs, including those who resist their practices, witnesses to crimes, former gang members, and family members of those who have been targeted. This discussion may be relevant when considering how to define a particular social group. And lastly, the note goes through the legal analysis of the refugee definition for individuals fleeing gang-related violence. And this includes looking at common forms of harm in gang-related cases, assessing the availability of state protection, and interpreting the convention grounds for a claim arising from gang violence with a specific focus on particular social group and political opinion. The last resource I want to talk about is UNHCR's eligibility guidelines. UNHCR's eligibility guidelines provide legal interpretations to assist adjudicators and attorneys in assessing the international protection needs of asylum seekers. as relevant to today's topic, UNHCR recently issued eligibility guidelines for El Salvador and Honduras that discuss certain risk profiles of individuals who may qualify for protection. On this slide, I've pulled out a few quotes from the guidelines that are relevant to today's topic and could be used to support a claim from El Salvador or Honduras. These quotes touch on conditions individuals are fleeing in El Salvador and Honduras, including high rates of homicide, domestic abuse, and the increasing levels of control gangs have over neighborhoods in the region. This information may be relevant to the well-founded fear analysis, or it could be used to provide the adjudicator with background information about what's happening in the country that the individual is fleeing. The eligibility guidelines for El Salvador and Honduras also identify what they refer to as risk profiles of individuals who may be eligible for refugee protection. Here I pulled out a few risk profiles. There are more and they are more detailed as well in the actual guidelines, but these include informants, witnesses and victims of crimes committed by gangs, claims based on family membership, gender-based claims, children and youth who have been targeted by gangs, state agents, including members of the police and armed forces. I know that Anna is also going to talk about some of these profiles and how to go about the legal analysis, but in UNHCR's view, these are profiles of individuals who may qualify protection, either based on particular social group, political opinion, or one of the other convention grounds. So just to recap, I've included a list of available resources here, most of which we have already discussed. This includes Women on the Run and Children on the Run. UNHCR also produced a report called Uprooted, and that report looks at the situation facing unaccompanied children and separated children moving across the borders from Central America into Mexico. Other resources that we talked about were UNHCR's gang guidance note and the eligibility guidelines for El Salvador and Honduras. All of these resources were issued to assist with proper interpretation of the refugee definition, which, as we talked about, the U.S. has an obligation to uphold since it ratified the 1967 protocol. UNHCR's amicus brief in Bringas Rodriguez v. Lynch, a recent case concerning an LGBTI asylum seeker from Mexico, may also be helpful. That brief articulates UNHCR's position that improved country conditions, such as passing laws that protect same-sex marriage, does not necessarily suffice to reject an asylum claim. The adjudicator must also consider the situation on the ground, including whether those laws are enforced and whether they offer effective protection. All of these resources are available on our website, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna to go through the elements of an asylum claim and how to go about preparing a claim.
Okay, thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Alice, and thank you so much to UNHCR for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts and practice, and also to learn. I have to say I'm humbled a bit, because way back in the day, I've been practicing for 30 years, and way back in the day I did use UNHCR materials, and then for some reason over the years I've stopped doing so. And after being invited to this presentation, listening to Colleen and Alice, I think it's urgent and highly recommended that we use these materials for our clients to put the countries and their cases in context, and also to make a full record for appeal. Because I do have to say that I see a real evolution on this issue. I remember years ago when judges would sort of raise their eyebrows or laugh or say, what is that PSG? Similar to other issues like FGM. I also remember when UNHCR, thought that this issue was clearly not a protection issue, that it was common crime. And it's really rewarding to see how it has advanced. We have these fantastic guidelines, protection guidelines from UNHCR on gang-related claims, and we also have really positive law that we've all fought for, to have political opinion cases recognized, particular social group cases, gender cases. So this is a real, I feel positive about this, and we still have a big fight ahead of us, so I'm very happy to be here and learn from everyone. So what I'm going to do, folks, is I'm going to talk about the law on gang-related cases, and then I want to spend a lot of time talking how we prove our case. because I think that's important. Just to give you a little bit of background about our firm, we are a firm that actually started in the 1980s and represented hundreds and hundreds of people fleeing the Central American wars. And in fact, they were my first clients. I wasn't with the firm, then I was with another firm. But you know, we started representing hundreds of Central American clients fleeing the civil wars in their countries. And unfortunately, there wasn't a full and positive, peaceful response to the aftermath of those wars, and now we're seeing the violence that's in the region now. We're an immigration boutique firm. We're here in D.C., we're opening up in L.A., and we're in San Diego. And we have a very long history of involvement in immigrant and human rights issues, and I'm happy to say we're very, well, I'm not happy to say we have an awful lot of business post-Trump, and a lot of the paid business supports a very, very, very robust pro bono practice we have. So we're very happy to be here. So just let's move on to the refugee definition and elements of a claim. Colleen talked about this already, so I don't have to speak about this much, but just folks, you remember the INA, it says definition of refugee. So the elements, anybody unable or unwilling to go back home because of persecution or a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of one of the protected grounds. And we know the 5 protected grounds. So the next slide, and this is just, you know, what do we have to prove? So we have to prove that they're really afraid, and that's objective and subjective, right? So it can't be that they're just afraid because their neighbor has, you know, harassed them because he doesn't like them, or he's been mean to the family for personal reasons. There has to be a well-founded fear. People have to step back and say, well, gosh, I'd be afraid of that too. Persecution. We're going to talk later about the specific types of persecution that our clients, you know, men, women, and children who face gang-related persecution go through. And as many of you know, there's no definition in the regulations of persecution, but there's quite a bit of case law that defines it. And then we have to prove that all this happens on account of, you know, race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And frankly, for me, the cases, I don't have a real hard time even showing past persecution or well-founded fear of future. The challenge always, often, not always, but often in gang-related cases is the nexus, right? But again, I feel like we're seeing more and more positive case law on this issue. Okay, and then and something to remember, because I love this, and I always cite it in my briefs. It's a 1 in 10% chance, folks, right? So you don't have to, you know, you don't have to show that everyone would be terrified, that it's 100% terror or fear, right? It's a 1 in 10% chance of persecution. That's what you have to show, that 1 in 10% that it, you know, a 10% chance that that person could be hurt, could be persecuted. And again, like I said, the subjective and objective analysis. So somebody might say, well, the subjective analysis, well, that's silly. You know, they're coming to you, they're applying for asylum. This only, well, only this, in my practice, this has often come up with men, right? And just because, remember that they have to say they're afraid, you know, even before the asylum officer or even on the stand, but this comes up in men expressing their fear in the past for me. And then past persecution creates a legal presumption of a well-founded fear of persecution. So if you establish significant past persecution, then there's a presumption, well, yeah, they're going to be persecuted in the future. So it's important to, you know, focus on all the persecution in your case and, you know, front load that. So the whole issue of well-founded fear is a sort of a given, right? And frankly, when I go into court with these cases, I mean, many of my clients sadly have suffered some really horrific abuse or you know, terror by the gangs. And the judges, this is an easy one, the well-founded fear of persecution for the judges. Okay, and then as I said before, there's no single definition of persecution. So, you know, matter of Acosta talks about it. They look at past abuse considered cumulatively, so it's really important. I often, for example, when clients come in for a consultation, the initial time I meet them, you know, you have to tease out the information because they'll give you little by little, and it doesn't seem, you know, sometimes the information they give initially doesn't seem like standing alone. One thing would be persecution, but you have to cobble it all together, right? And the cumulative stuff, frankly, doesn't come in my gang-related cases, because gang-related cases, the persecution is so horrible It's usually in whistleblower cases, political opinion cases in some matters. But with the gang-related cases, the persecution, again, for many of my cases, is not the challenge, and that may be so in yours. And for example, this is, minor brief beatings, brief detentions, and sometimes I've had cases where there hasn't been a whole lot of past persecution, or it hasn't risen to that level, but it's very clear there will be future persecution. So that's the trick in these cases, where there isn't so much past, or the person hasn't suffered. Look what can happen in the future to people like him or her, right? Okay, and then so the persecution in gang-related cases, and I think I've seen all of these in my cases. So specifically, we represent a lot of young women. We represent minors, and then adult women who have experienced rape, sexual assault, sexual slavery. The gangs like to bring girlfriends in, beatings, threats. All of them have been threatened with violence or death. That often happens with my clients who have witnessed crimes, right? They're consistently threatened to keep quiet. It's important to talk about and to include in your brief, your evidence that you submit to the court, evidence of psychological, emotional, and developmental harm. What I find as I do more and more of these cases, I'm always amazed at how resilient most of my clients, in fact, I can't really think of any that come to me that aren't resilient are, and how brave they are in the face of all these things that if you or I experienced it, in one day or in a short period of time in our country would be debilitating, right? And I feel like sometimes I take for granted that it's so bad down there that I don't focus on the not so obvious harms, right? So it's important to, ask your clients first. You find out about threats of harm to family members, stalking, forced criminal activity. These are all these, but then you ask the effect of it, right? You ask how it made them feel, how it makes them feel now. What's their reaction to certain things? Do they keep up with the news? Do they talk to their family members about it? Do they talk to their friends about it? A lot of times my people don't talk to other people about it. It's just something that happened and they keep it inside. And I often have clients telling me, and I'm sure this happens with many of you, horrible things that happened to them for the first time ever. And they haven't spoken even to very, very close family members, right? And it's important to understand, because one of the things you want to show is the harm to them, and that's, we'll talk a little bit later about psychological evaluations. Okay, and the risk of harm to children and to families, right? Gang activity by family members or a caretaker, exposure to violence or criminal activity. All the parents out there, think about your kids being consistently exposed to violence in a neighborhood and seeing killings and threats and beatings, right? Or things coming into their home. So that is harm, an example of persecution to raise in your cases. The gang activity by family members, and we often have clients, we've had a handful of clients that an uncle, right, or a brother is a gang member, and that, triple, I don't know, to the 10th degree, raises the harm to that child because of the presence of that family member in the home and gang members coming. And then the children they are looking at, as potential recruits or girlfriends. So it's important to look like that. We have a case where one of our arguments is the child can't return because the uncle now lives in the house. His grandmother left to come up here and got asylum, but we certainly can't send a 17-year-old girl back to live in that house with her uncle who's a gang member. Okay, and the persecutor, and I think this one is relatively, in these cases, again, you have to prove it, you have to make sure you prove it. Maybe, it's persecutor can be a state or governmental actor or a private individual. Where it's a non-state actor, you have to show the government is unwilling or unable to protect, and you can establish it by proof that the state fails to act in country condition information. I loved what Alice said. I loved just the image of 450, I think, Colleen?
Yeah.
Out of how many municipalities?
470.
Right. Now, can you imagine that? 450 out of 470 municipalities, and there's gang presence there. It's important the country condition information is very strong on this. You can show lack of prosecutions, and oftentimes, a lot of my clients report that the police are involved in it. right? But again, I love that, and I was thinking about this going into court. For example, that municipality image, to go into court with a map, when we talk, and we'll talk about this later, you have to show that they can't be safe somewhere else in the country. You just go in with a map with a great big, I don't know, tattoo-looking thing of MS-13 in every municipality in Salvador, and I think that answers that quickly. Okay, so in most of our cases, in all of our cases, I mean in this case, we're arguing that the gang member, the gang itself or the gang member is the persecutor. And so it's important, when you're arguing this, it's important to consider the following things. You want to look at, the gang affiliation. And generally, our cases come from, a lot of MS-13 or the 18th Street, and there's also other gangs in Salvador, Honduras, in Guatemala. So in terms of, you want to look at their relationship with the state and how much the state controls them or how much corruption is involved and the state might actually cooperate with them. The role of the gang in the local society, how much do they control the society, how much do they, is their level of extortion, their cooperation with the police or the police's fear of them, their strength nationally and transnationally. I think MS-13 is the strongest one now. So it's good to get reports about that. And again, we talked a little bit about the relationship of the gang to the government, the local and national government. And I often have, I think I've had cases where, I ask my clients, have you reported what happened to the police? And what they say is that the gang members hang outside the police stations. So the issue is they hang outside. I mean, if they're just hanging out, they're not obviously doing anything criminal, so the police can't do anything to them. But the fact that they're hanging out right outside the police station and the police sort of don't seem to be bothered by that is another example of how, it's intimidation and how strong they are, what a strong threat they are, right? Okay, we just talked a little bit about this. I talked about low prosecution rates and failure to protect witnesses, and it's interesting because I think there's been this issue about witness protection programs, and I think there's a witness protection program in Salvador. Now, I haven't seen the government bring this up, but it's something, these are things you should be prepared for when the government wants to talk about, because there are successes, right? There are arrests that happen, there are investigations that happen in these countries, and the government often doesn't agree with these cases or agree to settle them. So you want to make sure you have answers to any concerns they raise. And while there may be a witness protection program, and I think I used this in a brief, there is a witness protection program in Salvador, but they've only been able to protect 1 or 2 witnesses. I had a client who the government, actually it was in Honduras, who provided significant testimony against gangs, and the government provided, and I'm putting in quotes, protection to him, and his family had to leave their family home and go into a very remote side of the country, and they take all sorts of measures, and all their children have left, and they take all sorts of measures to avoid contact with a lot of people. So that witness protection program, or their offer of protection, certainly didn't help. But you need to be ready to address that. Okay, and now this, to me, this is the challenge, not in all my cases, but in, quite a few. Especially the ones, frankly, when I think about this, it's the young men that are coming up that may not have had any significant gang violence against them or their family members, but, it's the whole thing about they're 12, they're 13, they're walking to school, and they're always hurt, they're harassed, they try to get recruited, our eyes are on you, you're going to soon join us, and then they come up, right? And the same thing with young girls, because with the young girls, they're targeted for sexual reasons, to be girlfriends, and so those cases, in some senses, are the most difficult if there's nothing more around them. So the nexus can be persecution suffered on at least one of the protected grounds. So we identified this before, but race, like for example, when I think of race in Central America, I think more in Guatemala of the indigenous groups, right? Because in Guatemala, there's areas where there's large populations of the indigenous folks. Religion, maybe somebody's persecuted because they are too religious, or too little religion. Nationality, it's not just citizenship. Again, it could be ethnic, and then I think it overlaps with race. Political opinion, is, you know, a rule of law. I've had clients that report on people that took a real stance in a neighborhood, people that were upset with the corruption of the government, upset with the gangs, and refused to cooperate in any way with them, and they've been murdered. So if they had family members, you know, that came here, you know, you would argue, you know, their political opinion, etc. Membership in a particular social group, this is often obviously the largest one, and the most complex basis for asylum, often. Okay, so this is important when you're drafting your brief and making your argument and presenting your evidence. You have to show that it has to be at least one central reason. So, and there can be mixed motives. So I was thinking about this, and I'm thinking, well, gang members, let's think of a gender example. And I'd be interested during the question phases if people also have their own example that they can share with us. So, you know, it's an opportunity. I'm trying to think. So they go after girls. They go after girls for their gender, right? And it's an opportunity too, right? They target people. You know, maybe they're you know, they go after her for sex, for their gender, but also misogyny, right? Because you want to make an argument of, and especially if the young girl, in my case, a lot of my clients are young girls that absolutely refuse them for religious people, but also for a really strong sense of who they are as a young woman, and for feminist reasons. Now, maybe they're not going to articulate it the way I would as a 58-year-old lady, right? But, you know, it's clear that it's because of that. And then if you can identify how the gang members talk to them, if there is misogynist language, you know, derogatory language, so, you know, they can have mixed motives. Okay. And then action and words and circumstantial evidence. This is, I'm sure folks know this. And again, in these cases, there's so much action, there's often words, and we don't need that much circumstantial evidence because there's an awful lot of action and words in these cases. Okay, so in gang-related cases, so this is the challenge. So you got to show that they're after your client, not because they want to grow their business like a businessman or businesswoman, right? Or are they just stealing money, or they want to seek revenge? Because that's the arguments we always get from the government, that this is common crime. We're so sorry your clients live in a bad neighborhood, right? But it does not rise to the refugee definition. Okay? So as I was saying with the gender issues, did gang members say anything about protected grounds? Important to talk to your clients about exactly when an event happened, who was saying what? What were they doing? Are they known for behaving like that generally? Do they talk about that? Have they heard them talk about that in other contexts? Religion. So we represent people that proselytize. And so I'm thinking of an example of a couple that proselytizes and they go to both gang areas, which is a problem too, because in that case, gang number one wanted them to give information about gang number two when they came to proselytize in gang number one's area. But aside from that, they gave an example of they were proselytizing in an area, they were talking to a gentleman in the doorway of his home, and there was a gang member who, put his finger into a gun and clicked the trigger and said, "These religious people are hurting us." I mean, that's a pretty strong statement, right? And they're hurting them because they could also be reducing recruitment, right? So there's the direct evidence. And then where there's no direct evidence, then you turn to your country conditions, your expert testimony to show why gangs are motivated to commit some crimes. And as Alice was discussing, UNHCR has, remarkable materials, really strong materials, and a lot of the organizations do as well. I think KIND also came out with a report on gender and gang violence recently. So there's a lot of materials. We're very fortunate to have a lot of materials now to present to the courts. Okay, for race, so again, indigenous use, they're susceptible to gang recruitment, exploitation, or trafficking. And so a gang member, and this is business, because I think of them too as businessmen. I don't want to put that in my brief because then it doesn't look like a refugee definition. But, they go into a town and it's all indigenous folks, who's going to be best to sell their product, right? The young indigenous kids in town. That's the best one, and not some sort of tattooed guy from from Guatemala City. They're going to want to use their locals to sell and move their product because they're indigenous. Okay, in religion, So the recruitment of children active in churches and is seen as influential in their community. And this actually can be a competition for the gangs. And actually, a lot of gang members leave to return to the church. There's an interesting report from the Florida International University on the new face of street gangs in Salvador, and one of the things they talk about in there is the demographic of people, leaving the gangs because they want to, they want to go back to church. So, recruitment of children active in churches is good for the gangs because it can, stop the flow back or, increase their numbers, right? And their symbolic value. If somebody that's religious joins the gang, then the gang's a good place, right? It's a family. Maybe they can recruit other young people to join. In establishing persecution based on religion, you may look for an expert. You might seek statements from leaders of the church. Find out how the gang knew of the applicant's religion. In my client's case, they were Jehovah's Witnesses, so they had the whole Jehovah Witness material. It was easy for them to know that they were religious people. Does the gang target the church, etc.? Okay, and so moving to this one, and this one for me is a challenge, and I'd love to hear for other people if it's a challenge as well. But establishing the protected ground of political opinion with the resistance gangs, right? So, we have clients that have gone to the police. I do have clients that have gone to the police. I have a woman that reported a murder to the police, right? Because she did believe in the rule of law, and she had to flee because of threats afterwards. They might be anti-violent. They might be pacifists. I haven't really come across any that have told me directly they're pacifists, but anti-corruption. I have come across a lot of my clients who are just fed up with the corruption of the government, fed up with the gangs, and because they do believe that a country should be run differently. And girls, and as I mentioned before, girls might resist based on a belief in women's rights, and this is something you have to tease out from a 16 or 17-year-old, asking them when they were little, what did they want to do with their lives? Where did they want to go? What sort of things can, do, their dreams to go to school, their dreams to be somebody, their dreams to have respect, and how they want to have a marriage with somebody. You have to tease all those out to show a judge this is a young feminist who is not going to stand up for some gang treating her like that because she believes in her full rights, right? So these are some of the opinions on political opinion. Where the court's granted. So refusal to comply with FARC demands, refusal to be recruited by Palestinian, the Islamic Jihad, Shining Path, and then there's an FMLN violence. Opposition to FMLN violence can be a political opinion. So these are cases that we should use when we're making arguments about resistance as a political opinion. Okay, so the particular social group, and this is where almost, a lot of our cases fall. And again, when we make these arguments, we should make as many arguments or address as many protected grounds as possible in presenting our claim. So, so for the particular social group, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, with the elements and the case law. So it has to be an immutable or fundamental characteristic. Socially distinct, so society has to see the group as socially distinct, not the gang, eh? It has to be society that has to see the gang, the group as socially distinct, and it has to be particular. Okay, so so again, and I was just saying this during this last slide, I think it's important to add other grounds when you're to put this together. So consider age, childhood, youth, and any other characteristics. Nationality, race, family, sexual orientation. So I have represented clients who have been used by the gangs to extort. So they would use them, and this is a business decision. So they wouldn't send their tattooed members out. They used young gay men to go and collect la renta. So that case was a good. I mean, it was a particular social group, a young gay man, and and also political opinion, etc. I use several different bases, but they do use other people to commit their crimes. Okay, the lack of adult supervision or protection. This is a big one. This comes up more, I suppose, when kids get to a certain age and someone can't protect them, like elderly grandparents. Witness to organized crime as a particular social group, and I have represented several peoples that have been witnesses to crime and their family members. Former gang members, this has been a recognized particular social group, and then residents in female-headed households, and we've made that argument in a couple cases and they're pending. I'd be curious if any of our audience has made those and they've been successful. Okay, the social distinction, and again, important to read these cases, be very familiar with them, and be prepared to argue them in court and include them in your brief. So social visibility doesn't mean literal visibility, but it's whether the particular group is recognized as something different, distinct, right? Separate, or from society. And again, as I said, it's not the gang members' view. It's society's view of whether or not they are socially distinct. And again, these are the cases for particularity, because you also have to, identify how they are particular. So some bad case law, for example, WGR, said former gang members failed the particularity of crime because the group can include persons of any age, sex, or background. Well, I don't think it can include persons of any age, because they generally focus on young. But these are the things you have to look at, and you have to be prepared to argue how your particular social group is, how your group is particular. Okay, and the presumption of future fear, and this for me is not this is not a hard one. I think that the country conditions seem to be getting worse. And your client will testify about, information that he or she knows about after they left. I often have clients come in and tell me, other people were killed, the gangs are extorting even more in a certain neighborhood. But the issue of internal relocation comes up, and that's why I loved when they were talking. I mean, I feel badly for Honduras, but the image of 450 out of 475 municipalities being controlled by gangs, there's no issue about internal relocation, right? And I actually think, just as a visual, it's important, folks, if you can, as part of your evidence, go in with a map and show that. I haven't seen internal relocation in these cases be an issue. The government raises it, and we always have evidence to show that it's not, they're not safe somewhere else, and the judges never seem, frankly, to be concerned about this. But I'd be curious to hear from others who might have a different experience. Okay, and again, I put this in there in case things get better, but frankly, well, when this would come up, and I have actually had this. I have one of my clients, the gang member who killed a family member was put in jail, not for that crime, for something else. And at the time that we were adjudicating the asylum case before the immigration judge, he still had about 2 years before he was going to be released. And what we did is we framed the persecutor as the gang rather than just this individual, and that's what you have to do. And I think that's good to do in general, and then, identify the individual. But the gang is, it's a brotherhood, or it is like a corporation. If someone harms them, if someone harms one of theirs, they will harm that person. So it's important to show that. And again, if there's no harm several years, and I haven't had this, it'll come up at some point, I suppose. You can use expert testimony that gangs don't forget, that they have a long memory, right? That they will persecute your guy after he comes back, or your gal. Okay. Okay, so I want to talk now a little bit about proving the case and what we do when we have a case, when we have a client come in, and the best way to prepare the case. So just for the next slide, these are the things. I always do an outline. and I do an outline brief. Your gang is the persecutor. You identify what's your past persecution, what's the protected ground, what's the nexus, and what's the future fear and humanitarian asylum. And humanitarian asylum, I won't talk about it, at length now, but it's where there is such significant past persecution that asylum can be granted, even where there doesn't seem to be significant future persecution. In our cases, unfortunately, there is significant future persecution, generally, as a matter of course. So your client comes in, and you get all the information you can. You talk to them, talk to family members, and then you decide how you're going to frame it, right? And we're going to do 2 case examples at the end that are pretty rich in terms of issues. So we'll address some of these. So resistance to gang recruitment. So this is often, so I'm going to go through these and say what I find sometimes challenging and what aren't, and I'd love to hear other people's wisdom and experience. The resistance to gang recruitment often comes in, as my father would say, an old Irish guy says, he voted with his feet. They leave, right? And that's how they resist. They refuse to join. They change their habits in terms of how they're walking to school. They avoid certain people, okay? They take actions to resist, and they resist because they're devout. They may have religious views. They don't believe in it. And these are the hard cases to prove, and especially when you have a teenager and they don't talk that much and tell you how they feel, right? So you have to do a lot of work working with them to find out what they think, how they worked, how they avoided the gangs, etc. Former membership in a gang has been recognized as a particular social group. Imputed rival gang membership, this often comes up in kids that live in one neighborhood and they go to school in another neighborhood, or they're friends with somebody, and they may be considered by a rival gang to be in that group. I actually had it of a client who lived in MS-13. His girlfriend lived in 18, the 18 barrio, a neighborhood, and he would go there to visit her. And when he would go there, he was often beat up by members of the 18 because they thought he was a member of MS-13. When he went back to his neighborhood, MS-13 would ask for information about the 18 and beat him up because he said, look, I don't know anything. I was just visiting my girlfriend. Sadly, he ended up joining MS-13 to protect himself. So this is an issue in cases. Resistance to gang extortion, if people have a political opinion and they feel very strongly about the rule of law. And I think what you can find in terms of what happens to people that do this is that we often hear clients come in and tell us people that are killed by the gangs because people stand up because they are people that believe in the rule of law, and then they're shot and killed. Okay? Because they're a threat. When you think about it, they're a threat to the gang organization. Witness informant claims, PSG, this is often cases we are successful with. Gender claims, we represent a lot of women who have fled gang violence, either as girlfriends of gang members or the forced domestic relationship. So this is a particular social group, gender, and a particular opinion, because often these women are women that are standing up and saying, absolutely not, I have a right to my body, I have a right to my life, I have a right to choose who I'm going to be with, and it's certainly not going to be with you. And then children's claim. We see, the ones that I see more are children lacking effective family protection, and the ones that are family members of gang-affiliated persons. And these are particular social groups you want to describe to the judge what happens, right? They lack family. You want to set the scene. Their parents went up, because this is most of our cases, right, folks? They're with an elderly grandmother or an aunt or uncle, or family members that don't care about them and are negligent toward them. Okay? And again, family members of gang-affiliated person, that's like being in the belly of the beast. Even though their brother may love them or their tío may love them, they are a member of a gang, and they live in a home with that gang member, and his coates, his people, come to see him. So that's also a particular, particular social group. Okay, so resistance to gang recruitment. So these are the sort of things you want to show the harm to the child or the family after they resist recruitment attempts. What happens? Do they start extorting them more? Do they beat the family members? Do they threaten them? You know, and also, do they forcibly recruit them? Do they bring them to their gang hideouts? So you have to look at this. You have to ask that. And also you ask, what happens? Do they know other kids in the neighborhood that have refused, and what's happened to them? So you get a sense of the style of the gang and how they respond to refusal to join. Okay? Also look at why they targeted a particular child. Again, was this a child who maybe didn't have parental protection? And that often happens. Clearly, orphans or street kids, just think of vulnerability, folks, right? Their target are going to be easy targets. Indigenous kids, students all the time just because they're trying to recruit them, and then kids from poor neighborhoods. I don't think there's a whole lot of gang recruitment in, you know, gated communities in Guatemala. So they're focusing on poor kids whose parents don't live there, poor kids who perhaps it's only women in the house, because they view that as an, you know, prize recruitment. So make sure to get all the facts about their living situation and their relationships, their family relationships. Also look, is there any other protected ground? Okay, not just particular, you know, political opinion, any religious beliefs. Do they go to church all the time? Is this something they're completely against? Indigenous kids? Okay, so that's the resistance to the gang recruitment. And then, you know, we have some hard case law to overcome, right? That talks about gang recruitment not being a political opinion. But remember, these cases were decided on facts, and frankly, the facts make your case. I have clients that I win very difficult very difficult cases, and they come in and they think, you know, my one client called me a superhero, and I said to him, I'm not a superhero. You had unbelievable facts in your case, and our job is to get those facts out. So don't worry too much about the case law. Read it, be very familiar with it, be prepared to answer or respond to ISO, you know, ISO, the Assistant Chief Counsel's position on it, but your facts are going to save you. So again, so you can, how does a community view individuals who resist recruitment? You know, get statements from even people that are here. Well, that family was known for always being upright and talking about the role, how important, you know, democracy was, or how important it was to be able to walk outside your door and work without being threatened, etc., right? And did community members, you know, how did they respond to them? Did they help people who were anti-gang, or did they ignore them and isolate them? It's good to get expert testimony to support that this particular social group meets the standards, the legal standards, and then of course, you know, brief the issue, argue all the positive circuit, and distinguish the negative. Okay, just a little bit, and this is what we talked about. You know, you want to distinguish the bad case law. Recruitment decisions, some of the bad recruitment decisions only considered boys targeted for gang recruitment, but didn't look at other protected, PSG or other protected grounds that you can argue. And again, use as many different combinations as you can where the facts fit, religion, race, etc. Okay? And again, the example that I put here is gangs target kids for recruitment because of sexual orientation. That's, you know, first of all, they're going to be terrified of the gangs. Second of all, the police aren't going to think that young 18-year-old man who's a gang member is collecting the la renta. Okay? So they target them for those reasons. Okay, and so former gang membership, this is I feel like we may see this more and more. I've actually, most of my cases, I'd say 99% are people attacked by the gang, and I just received my first former gang membership case. And this is, and especially with the heightened enforcement folks around the country, so I feel like we'll see these more and more. You know, the circuit court law is good on this, finding that they are particular social groups. So in terms of our legal standards, this is not a big challenge. The challenge comes with bars to asylum withholding and discretionary issues. And again, and this is what I just said, keep in mind mandatory bars. And when you, if you do have an ex-gang member, it's important. You don't want ICE bringing out horrible testimony and you not knowing it. You need to sit down with your client and you need to ask them everything they did. What did a day in the life look for them from when they first joined until they left? And you have to ask them about everything that they did, okay? And what may happen depending on, what activities they were involved in, the mandatory bars may apply, and then you will have to argue for relief under the Convention Against Torture. And just a quick note about that, if you're arguing for relief for a Convention Against Torture, one of the things that the court may be concerned about is, danger to the security of the community in the United States. So you need to be prepared to address why your client will not be a danger. And that should include family, where they'll live, work. Are there any treatment plans? Are they undergoing? Do you have any therapy lined up? Do you have anger management courses lined up? But you need to be prepared for that because the court could easily grant CAT and then ICE keeps them for a while. Okay, imputed rival gang membership, and we've talked about this, and there is some case law. And again, matter of EAG, they considered it, but we think their reasoning was flawed. But the finding was evidentiary, and again, your facts are going to make your case. And the problem that we discussed before was for the perception that imputed rival gang members, the perception would be the gangs and not society. So you have to show it's society's perception. And again, arguing as many grounds as possible. So imputed membership, childhood, gender, etc. So gang extortion and threats. We want to talk a little bit about this. That persecution obviously equals death threats. If a target of extortion is a child and the threats are made against the child and the family, try to identify other motivations other than them wanting to make a lot of money. I sound like I'm beating a dead horse here. I keep saying this, but it's important to include as many grounds as possible, and that's why your fact gathering is very, very important. And so, for example, if a target is a family or caretaker and then the child's threatened, you can argue PSG of family, child, family members of persons extorted by gangs. And again, it's important to support this with expert testimony and get an expert to talk about who is targeted by the gangs and why. Okay, and just so there's a little bit, I wanted to share just some resistance to extortion law with you, and it's bad law. And just to be aware of this and distinguish or develop different facts. So the following groups, just victims of gang threats and possible extortion, no. People in the United States for a long time and their parents are U.S. citizens, no. So these simply as they are, that's why you have to add more facts and see if there's other grounds. Okay, and again, extortion and political opinion. And again, this is the problem. You have to get over the issue of whether it's just related to anything other than the person's greed, and that's sometimes difficult. And there's, for example, the Ninth Circuit found, this is an old case, Shining Path, the Shining Path in Peru. Refusal to make payments wasn't political opinion. So again, you have to develop why that person has a particular opinion. What is that political opinion? Who saw that person having that political opinion? Was that family known in the neighborhood? And they could have caused real problems for the gang because of their political opinion. So it's important to gather those facts. And then witness informant claims. And frankly, these are these are easier cases to win, and we've won these cases, and we've won several of them, right? So there's a lot of positive PSG findings in the circuits on this. So make sure you look in your circuit first to see if there is positive case law on witness informant cases. If not, look at the other circuits. Continue, and then just a couple of the negative ones. It's always good to read the negative ones, but again, I think the case law on this is pretty good, and be familiar with it and know what the bad case law is. Okay, and continuing on this, just also you can frame it as a political opinion in addition to particular social group, and then you have the two grounds there. So gender claims, and UNHCR has done a great job on reporting on gender claims, so has Kids in Need of Defense kind. So there's a lot of evidence in supporting country conditions for these claims. So you have to show direct evidence of gender as a central motivating factor. Did the guy go after the young woman because she was a girl, because of her gender, right? And we talked about this a little. It's important to talk to your clients about, how the gang members spoke to them. What sort of things did they say to them? What is their reputation in the community, right? Do people know? And women, all the women on the call know when you're growing up, you know who's the bad guy and who's the good guy and who's, misogynist and who's not, right? So it's important to get that information. And then what you show in terms of country conditions and persecution, and I think this is an easy one as well. For the Central American countries, you show that state and society accept violence against women. The country conditions, there's significant country conditions about the violence against women. And I think even the statistic is, when I see these presentations and listen to, for example, Alice's presentation, it's really shocking, folks. Think about your small neighborhood and think about if 64% of the women in your neighborhood were sexually assaulted or abused. And that's what has to make us sit up straight and shock us, because I do feel like the more I do these cases, sometimes I'm not as shocked, but I need to be shocked and I need to present that shock to the court. So 64% of the women that came up and that were questioned by UNHCR on that report have been sexually assaulted or abused or experienced violence. A shocking figure. Failure of the state to respond, the femicides in Guatemala and in Salvador and the countries, no investigation, no prosecution, no one cares. The value of a woman's life, that's what you have to talk about. What is the value of a woman's life in that country? The value of a woman's life is proven by whether or not there's prosecution, whether or not there's shelters for women, whether or not there's investigations, right? And so very little of that exists. And then the discriminatory laws, right? No recognition of marital rape, girls can get married young, and even if they change the laws, because this comes up occasionally in cases, and I always think this is frankly a weak argument because the country conditions are so strong. The fact that a country has a law that protects a person and protects a woman, you scratch behind it, well, that's really nice, we're glad, that's a first step, and then, no one's been prosecuted for violating that law, and in fact, this is the percentage of people that violate it, I don't think those are hard arguments to make. Okay, domestic violence by gangs, you would just establish it's the same as gender-based violence, and you just add the gang member as a persecutor, right? And then consider gender, as we keep saying, in addition to marital status, indigenous status, the age, opposition to cultural norms or customs, and again, feminist, a young woman expressing their right to their body, their mind, and their life. And then, of course, sexual orientation and gender identity. Okay, and then forced domestic relations, and we see this. I've seen this quite a bit. They attempt girls to become their girlfriends, and even in situations, I have clients when they're 14-year-old, they think one of the gang members is cute, they go out with them, and then when they break up with him and they want to leave him, and that's when the persecution really starts. Because the gang member doesn't want to leave them. I've had clients that had to leave and live in another area, and then gangs targeted her in another area, and she had to leave the country to escape her ex-boyfriend. So this happens often, and they're punished if they leave. And I'm sure, and it's in one of the case examples, we just used it as an example, but I've had several young women talk about how young women are found murdered. And murdered in very violent ways, and they're generally women that have broken up with gang members and their bodies are desecrated, or they've gone out with gang members in other neighborhoods. There's evidence to show this. So what you do next is you do childhood gender resistance. Again, girls are viewed as the property of the gang. That's very clear. They're unable to leave, and those who resist are in trouble. Okay. And so this goes through, how you frame the claim a little bit. And then it identifies certain subgroups of kids that are especially at harm, subject to harm. And again, we talk about this. It's like, who lived in the house? Who took care of them? Does the child have a disability? It's interesting because I'm starting to ask my clients, in order to determine, actually, this is not gang related, but it's, sexual abuse by family members, how big the house they lived in, how many bedrooms were in the house, right? So it's always trying to get a snapshot of what their life looked like, right? Who was there? Who took care of them? So even if they had older people in the house, that's not enough. What was their relationship with the older person, okay? We talked a little bit, I think I've talked about this quite a bit. And again, the issue of who's taking care of the children and finding out what their relationship was. And this is for PSG of children lacking effective familial protection. Let me go. And traffic. Now, it's interesting because I haven't had, but this is obviously a very strong claim, a PSG claim. I have not had clients that have been trafficked by the gang. I've had clients that are ex-girlfriends. I have clients that who've harassed women and they've escaped. Clients that are, people that have joined the gang and left. But I mean, this certainly happens. They do force kids. They may, and the kids that might be the most vulnerable, obviously, are like orphans or people without familial protection, etc. Right? They extortion. They hide weapons. They'll act as lookouts, they sell drugs, and they'll be sex trafficked. And look to see how vulnerable your child was, and they're the biggest targets for the gang members. Okay, and we talked a little bit about this too. Find out, who was living in the house, any connection with the gangs, what role did the family member have with the gangs? How often did the gangs come to the home? Was there any suggestions or language towards the girls or boys in the house? But this is a very strong, I think this is a strong PSG. Okay, and this is just a family membership case law that I wanted to share with folks, just for you to be familiar with. And so, the First Circuit, a nuclear family is a recognizable PSG. Crespin-Valladares, I argue all the time here in the Fourth Circuit, and have had several clients who were family members of witnesses to crimes, and that's been an easy win. The courts, obviously, they recognize this law, and they're willing to grant as long as other elements are established. Okay, and a little bit more, just examples of family membership cases and PSGs in those cases. I think we'll go to the next slide. This is just for folks to be familiar with. Okay, this is an important one for especially folks for the, as you get more and more former gang members as your clients, this is going to be a big issue. The most of the, if they've committed an aggravated, well, that's in the United States, bars with high, particularly serious crime, serious non-political crime committed outside the U.S., persecutive of others. Now, that's for protected ground, right? It has to be for race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or particular social group. Danger to the security of the United States or terrorism, right? The Nazi thing, I mean, we're so many years, I don't see that coming up, and or participation in genocide, and I don't see that coming up as much, in Central America as it would in other parts of the world. The thing that's the hardest for me with ex-gang members is the serious non-political crime committed outside the United States, and then the danger to the security of the United States, right? So hopefully the facts in your case will be that your client was a gang member and maybe was there just a little bit and didn't do that many bad things. And then you have to argue why the fact that he, hid guns for the gangs, or maybe he distributed drugs for the gangs. You have to look and determine exactly what they did and be very, very careful and detailed in questioning them, because you do not want an ICE attorney to get up there and ask questions that'll destroy your case, and the judge will hate your client. So you need to get all that information out ahead of time, and especially if there's a danger to security of the United States issue, then you have to present evidence to the court of why they won't be and what the person's going to do when they get out of when they're released from detention. So I think that's it, and I'm wondering if we go to the case example, or
yeah, I know we have a few questions pending, so I want to make sure that we answer people's questions, so why don't we do that first, Perfect. And then at the end we can go through a case example if there's time.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'll put the facts up here just so people can read the case example that we'll do after the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one of the questions that we've got is, in regards to political opinion, is it enough to oppose a particular political situation? So if a person says, I oppose what's happening in my country, or do they need to articulate or subscribe to an alternative political idea?
The more details, the better. I would say, that you oppose what's happening in your country is not enough. I mean, what you have to say is, I believe in a rule of law. I believe, if a crime's committed, I should be able to go to the police and report it without being fearful of my life. This is why I believe it, because when Mrs. Garcia taught me in second grade, about, respect for others, in the history of our country, I learned this about a particular individual who inspired me, right? So what you want to do is you want to have them be very clear about that, and then you want to talk to them about their family members and see how their family behaved, right? Because all of us have our own culture in our family, right? And, some people feel more strongly about things than others. So you want to be specific, and you want to show why they have that. You don't want to just say, well, I don't like what they do. That's not going to do it.
Great. Thank you for that. Another thing I just want to say right now is that the PowerPoint slides are available on the right-hand side of the presentation, and we will be sending them out afterwards as well. Next question, in regards to children's claims, can children assert a political opinion, and does their opinion need to be clearly formed in the same way as an adult?
Right, I think so. Well, I don't think it has to be the same way as an adult, but you talk to, kids have strong feelings, right? Some do. I'm a grandmother now, so I know through kids and grandkids, they have strong feelings. So you ask them why they feel strong. And kids have a real sense of, frankly, a real sense of justice, too. So you have to ask them, why they have that sense. Develop it. Ask examples when they were growing up, what they felt about something that they saw that happened and what they did. You want to make their political opinion or what they feel about this very real, and make the judge see them as a person and how they would, of course, be in grave danger if they were returned because of their political opinion.
Great, and I know on our behalf from UNHCR also has guidelines on child asylum claims, and that goes through an analysis of political opinion from a child's point of view, so taking into consideration their age and gender and their background, so that might be useful to look at as well. So the next question is, how necessary are country condition experts in these cases, and how do you find experts to provide testimony? Okay,
so I think, let me just say generally, I think less is more. I'm not saying country conditions, but you don't want to submit a brief in country conditions material that are 10 inches high. You want to target. You want to do a targeted brief. You want to do country conditions targeted. I actually think it's great if it's a particular social group that case law doesn't necessarily support. I think it's good to get an expert to explain why that person is a target. In terms of who you get, for example, there's a group called Insight Crime here in D.C., and there's a man named Steve Dudley who has lots and lots of experience with this issue, so we go to him for cases. I think there's also a man named Thomas Borman. I haven't used him in a long time, but he's an expert as well. And I'm not sure if UNHCR has a list of experts, but maybe this is something, you know, we could all start to share, or you know, we'll find a central place, or we'll find some place to do this. But an expert also can be, look at your local universities and people that are doing, you know, history and poli-sci. That's where you find them too. So you have to be creative.
Great. And I know last month in our last webinar, we did a webinar on gender claims, and we had the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies on that webinar. They're putting together a database of experts. I don't think that they have released it yet. But I know, I think on their website, if you have a question from a particular area, there's a request form you can fill out, and they may be able to connect you with someone. So we have a specific case question. Has anyone, it could be others on the webinar, but has anyone had success with a PSG focused on gang recruitment of teenage men who are athletes? In this case, the gangs would stalk his client outside soccer practice. Compared to his peers, he seemed to be stronger and more athletic, so perhaps that was why they singled him out. Any creative arguments you could think of? I don't know if that would be similar to any cases that you would have.
Sort of like it because he could be the enforcer. You know, I mean, I think it's a creative one. If they targeted him more than they targeted other people, and it seems they have, that's something you should, you know, definitely use, right? I think I would try. I wonder if anybody else out there, you know, has heard of it.
Yeah, I don't. If you have, you can raise your hand, and I can turn your microphone on if you would like to say something. But I know another thing that reminds me of is what you said earlier, that kind of in our last presentation they said, like, throwing spaghetti at the wall. You don't just need to have one group. You kind of want to try everything that works. So maybe. Right. There are other arguments that they would want to look at as well. So what evidence have you used to show social distinction? How do you show what society sees as a group? That's a really interesting question. It's a good question, and I'm trying to think. I haven't had to do that in any of my cases yet because I've had the protected ground. And I think it would be interesting to get, for example, I wonder if you could get local professors, you know, or university professors in the country that could write a statement about that. Social studies, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, and Colleen, you should think too, like a social studies professor or anthropology, an anthropologist, or even, this is really interesting. I mean, maybe this makes no sense, but affidavits from, you know, community groups. Is there any, you know, are there local community groups? You know, it's sort of trying to prove what we all know, right? You all know when you live in a neighborhood like that, who's targeted and who isn't. So it's figuring out who can say that with credibility. And that might come from a community group, it might come from a teacher or a principal from a high school, right there. So I'm not sure, but that's a great question. That is a good question, yeah. I know UNHCR doesn't have any guidance particularly on social distinction, but I think our eligibility guidelines for El Salvador and Honduras, they mentioned they go through certain risk profiles. In the analysis for each of those profiles, there's examples, or UNHCR uses a lot of country condition evidence, so that might be another area to look at. And that reminds me that we've gotten a couple questions about UNHCR's eligibility guidelines. They have issued guidelines for El Salvador and Honduras, so a lot of people asking why not Guatemala as well. And I know that there aren't any available right now to answer that question, but I do believe UNHCR has done reports on Guatemala in the past. They've probably become a little dated now, and I believe that our offices are looking into developing more reports as well. Let's see, next question. This question is asking about, can you give more discussion about the safe third country argument for asylum seekers that cross through Mexico? Heard this coming up on the fringes of discussions. This is at the discretion of the judge, correct? Right. So,
So what I'm trying to think. This is a really good question because my clients come up very quickly, and I'm sure yours do as well. And I haven't had this be an issue. And I suppose the safe third country, you'd look at case law, and I don't have it off the top of my head, unfortunately, and make arguments why Mexico isn't a safe third country. I mean, there's certain standards, and that they can't stay there. Most of my clients are joining family members in the United States. But this is a good question, and this is why I like doing these presentations, because you've made me think, and I'm gonna look into this.
So another question, I believe it's asking how detrimental, if at all, to a case is it if one family member decides to stay in the country. So, for example, a mom decides to stay, but the grandma and child leave. How detrimental is that to a case?
So, you have to show, well, it depends on your PSG, right? And then you have to show the circumstances of the particular case. So that's hard. That depends on the facts of the case and why they stayed, and could they stay, or are they safe there, or do they stay in their house most of the time? I have clients that some family members stay, some come, and most of the family members that stay remain essentially locked into their homes and only leave under certain conditions. So that's a very factual-based question, factual-based investigation.
Okay, another case example from someone on the webinar. They have a 17-year-old client, and when their client was 14, he was abused by his mother, forcing him to become a gang member and go out with a girlfriend out of desperation. They liked your PSG based on parental neglect. How would that PSG, parental neglect, overcome any dangers of the 14-year-old knowingly going out with a gang member?
This is a great question. I think it would be PSG based on, parental neglect and lack of protection. I don't think the PSG would be overcome by that. Now, if this is an ex-gang member, remember you have to find out everything they did. Another thing that we're looking into, and I'm doing a lot of research on it, and is, how do you mitigate the acts of a 14-year-old, right? But you're a 14-year-old. I can't see. Let me see the bottom of the question again, Colleen. Sorry, it was 14. Oh, no. Overcome any dangers knowing. I don't think I don't think a 14-year-old girl. I think you can make very strong arguments that she didn't knowingly. Or she didn't voluntarily go out with the young man. Even if she did, even if she became sort of enamored and had the relationship, her mother forced her into it. The person that is primarily in charge of her forced her into it. She's a 14-year-old girl, and she left. She fled because she knew it wasn't that. And then you want to talk about 14-year-olds. And then also, I'm doing research on a case for the adolescent brain and the capacity of children to make decisions and how much responsibility they can be, they hold for certain decisions. So we're doing a lot of that, and that comes up in the context. This is just another evidentiary issue that I've been thinking about with former gang members. We're reaching out to forensic experts, forensic criminal experts that deal with kids that are in the criminal justice system and trying to keep them in the juvenile system rather than going to the adult system, and they do a lot of work on mitigating an adolescent brain, and especially after complex trauma. So it's good to think about that stuff.
Yeah,
okay.
So a little broader question, for domestic violence asylum cases, what type of evidence do you feel helps with your cases? There's certain, I don't know if they're asking for reports or...
report. I guess, when you put together a case, folks, what you do is a brief and a brief, okay? It should be a guide for the judges to, sort of, insert their decisions. Witnesses, so did they go to the police? Maybe they didn't, but it's witnesses, witness statements, people that knew of the relationship, people that knew that she was beaten by her partner. Her own declaration, her own statement, a psychological evaluation. We do psych evaluations all the time. Our psychologists often talk about malingering. They'll talk about whether they're malingering or not, and they say, I did not find this person malingered. So it's all sorts of evidence. I find that the domestic violence cases aren't that hard if they're strong cases, but it's important to make sure to get as many, the witnesses, make your client, her declaration or his, and go from there.
Great, yeah, and I know the organization that I mentioned earlier, Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, they also have a database of cases. So if you want to find cases that have been successful or look for what has been rejected, there's a way you can request cases on that. So I think we have just 2 more questions. The first one, are you aware of any case law regarding evangelical Christians as a target for gangs or for political opinion based on religious beliefs, anti-gang and anti-crime?
No, I'm not, but I am doing one with a Jehovah's Witness, but that's not going to happen for Arlington Asylum Office is backed up 3 years. We've just filed. I'm not aware of any particular one, so sorry I can't answer that.
That's all right. And let's see, so the last question.
Oh, yeah.
How do you address TRIG, the terrorism-related grounds to admissibility, and material support of terrorism considerations, especially when there's evidence of extortion?
Right. So I was thinking of this when I was preparing this, and I didn't do my homework on it because I haven't had this issue of them being called terrorists and material support come up. But I'm sorry to say I can't answer it, and I want to think more about it. Colleen, I was just going to mention, because there's a helpful comment here from a colleague saying the question about social visibility, about gang girlfriends, they're using local press reports. And we also, and that's a great suggestion, and we also are looking to local press more and more because I think folks, we get sort of too comodo, we get too comfortable, and we do the, what do you call it, the usual suspects, Department of State, Amnesty, etc. I think the local press should play a bigger role in our cases in terms of materials.
That's great. That's a good suggestion. And I know, just lastly, a quick question. We had to repeat the name of the organization that has a database of cases. That's the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies. And to also highlight that we have done webinars in the past on children's claims, women's claims, and LGBTI. Those are all posted on our website with the slides. So some of these cases overlap with those issues as well. So you might want to take a look. We are a little over time, so I don't know if you want to go through the case example.
Why don't I go through one quickly and just highlight what we think the argument should be. I'm sure most of you folks will find the same thing. I do have a couple more minutes. So Angela from Salvador, she came when she was 14 as an unaccompanied minor and was placed in removal proceedings, and then she was released to her parents. When she was 6, her mother testified against gang members about a murder that the mother had witnessed. Very brave political opinion on the part of the mother, somebody who believed in the rule of law and believed it was horrible that this happened in her neighborhood. Shortly after the mother testified, they firebombed the home. The gangs firebombed the family home. The grandmother was injured, and then they had to flee. After the move, her parents left to go to the United States to make money to take care of them. And they thought that if the family moved, the family would be safe, and if they sent money back, they could go to better schools. Angela never felt good in her neighborhood or safe, and of course when she was 13, the leader of the gang came to her and asked her to be his girlfriend. She refused, she refused, didn't want to have anything to do with him, was very clear that she wanted to study and stay in school. He harassed her, threatened to hurt her, threatened to kill her if she continued to refuse. And this, several months later, one of her friends was found dead inside a locker. Okay? And then Angela was threatened again, and she left. So in this particular example, I would say that you probably could argue political opinion if you talk to her more about it, because here's this young woman that resists, so you want to find out why. And also, is she religious? Does she believe in God? Is there any religious background here? You would argue as family member of a witness, right? You would argue her gender and her age. And I think, would you argue that she had no family protection? Depends on her relationship with the grandmother, right? And who was taking care of her. So there are all the issues in that case, and I actually think that this would be a strong case for asylum. I think you have, past persecution, as a young girl that she's the victim of a firebombing. She's also a victim of death threats by the gangs. she is future persecution, clear what happened to another young woman in her town was killed, and the country conditions would establish that. The nexus would be, I would argue, political opinion. I would argue PSG, if you can, political opinion and religion. And I think you have your case.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. Yeah, it
Thank you.
sounds like a really strong case. From our perspective, international law, if you wanted to use any of those arguments as well, I would just point to the eligibility guidelines from El Salvador. I think several of the risk profiles identified in those guidelines overlap with what Anna has already said. Family membership, claims based on gender, and lack of protection in the home. So maybe it might be useful to look at that to support the claim as well. But so lastly, two last things I want to say. We are trying to collect a database of individuals, attorneys who might want to take on pro bono cases. So if that's something that interests you, please send me an email. My email is attached to the information for this webinar, and I will also be sending out the recording, so you'll have it that way as well. And lastly, I just want to thank our speakers, Anna and Alice. You guys both did a fantastic job, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, folks, and thanks for sharing your wisdom.
All right. Bye-bye.